Today, we're going to talk about a war that's been almost completely erased from our popular memory, but was, believe it or not, absolutely critical in shaping the United States. Welcome to The Explainer.
So, let me just start with a question for you. What do you think was the deadliest war in American history? I mean, your mind probably jumps to the Civil War, right? Or maybe World War II, and, those are the usual answers.
But what if I told you that, when measured by the percentage of the population that died, the deadliest, most destructive conflict in American history actually happened 100 years before the American Revolution was even a thing?
Yeah, we're talking about Ken Philip's War, a vicious 14-month-long struggle that didn't just change New England. It created a dark blueprint for the future of the nation and forged a brand new, much tougher American identity.
Now, this explosion of violence, it didn't just come out of nowhere. It was more like a 50-year fracture, a slow, grinding breakdown of a really complex relationship between the English colonists and the native peoples who had lived there forever.
I mean, we all have that image in our heads of the first Thanksgiving, right? This symbol of peace and harmony. But the reality? No, it was way, way more complicated. For about 50 years, it was this shaky balancing act, really. It was built on mutual need, for sure, but underneath, all this friction was building up, just poisoning the well.
By the 1670s, it wasn't just friction anymore. It was a full-on assault on the native way of life. The English idea of owning land meant native lands were constantly shrinking. English farm animals roaming free were basically a form of ecological warfare, wiping out native cornfields. English law was being forced on them unfairly, and the Puritan missionaries were setting up these praying towns that really threatened to just erase native culture completely.
And this quote from the Wampanoag leader Metacom, the English called him King Philip, man, it just says it all. This wasn't some kind of dramatic threat. This was a man looking at the world around him and seeing with perfect clarity that his entire country, his people's whole existence, was about to be wiped off the map.
So the final spark came in 1675. An informant, a Christian Indian named John Sassamon, turns up dead. The Plymouth colony investigates. They arrest 3 of Metacom's most senior advisors, and then they hang them. For the Wampanoag, this was the ultimate insult, a complete violation of their sovereignty. For Metacom, that was it. It was a declaration of war.
And when that spark hit the tinderbox, the whole of New England just erupted. This wasn't a limited conflict. It became a total war for survival that unleashed a level of brutality that honestly shocked everybody involved. You see, native warriors absolutely terrified the English with what the colonists called the skulking way of war. It was brilliant guerrilla warfare, ambushes out of the dense woods, lightning-fast raids. It totally upended the European way of fighting in neat lines and completely neutralized the colonists' advantage in pure numbers.
The stories themselves are just harrowing. But to really, truly get your head around the scale of this disaster, you've got to look at the cold, hard data.
Okay, so just look at these numbers. For the colonists, this war was already nearly twice as deadly as the American Civil War. That's insane. But then you look at that top line. What this war meant for the native people of New England? It's just staggering.
50%. I mean, just let that sink in for a second. Roughly half of the entire Native American population in the region was gone. Killed in combat, starved to death, or sold into slavery. This wasn't just a war. For them, it was a demographic apocalypse.
So when the fighting finally stopped, things didn't just go back to the way they were. The old world was gone, completely destroyed. And in its place, a new, much harsher reality was forged in the fire.
The outcome of the war basically created 2 totally different futures. For native peoples, it was the end of their political power, their world shattered, their people enslaved and scattered. But for the colonists, it was a baptism by fire that created a new identity, one that was fiercely self-reliant, militarily capable, and defined by a new, hardened racial ideology.
And we really have to be clear about the enslavement part. This wasn't some accidental byproduct of the war. It was deliberate colonial policy. Thousands of native survivors, including non-combatants, even Metacom's own wife and his 9-year-old son, were rounded up and sold into the brutal slave markets of the Atlantic world. It was a way to pay for the war, and it plugged New England right into the global slave economy.
And maybe this is the war's most lasting and most disturbing legacy. The brutal tactics that were perfected here, they didn't just stay in New England. They became a kind of repeatable playbook for conquest. First, you racialize your enemy to justify extreme violence.
Then you wage total war, not just against soldiers, but against civilians and their food supplies. And finally, you seize their land by right of conquest. This model would be used over and over and over as America pushed west.
So why should we care about a war that happened over 350 years ago? Because you can't really understand the complicated, messy, and often contradictory story of the United States without understanding King Philip's War.
It just rips away those sanitized myths about peaceful pilgrims. It shows us a nation that was born not just from lofty ideals of liberty, but from a brutally violent crucible of conquest. It created an American identity that was independent, yes, but also incredibly ruthless, and built on a foundation of racial hierarchy.
And that really leaves us with a big, final question to think about. The patterns that were set back in 1676, the racialization of an enemy, the justification for total war, they cast a really, really long shadow. So we have to ask ourselves, how do the echoes of this foundational, forgotten conflict still resonate in America today?